Good evening, everyone. I'm Paul Skinner, founder of MarketingKind, and welcome to this MarketingKind exchange, in which we'll be asking how small stories create big change with Professor Timothy D. Wilson, and of course with my co-host and fellow MarketingKind member, Emma Ihsan.
Thank you, Paul. I'd like to introduce MarketingKind briefly, as we have many guests with us this evening. We're a community of business leaders, marketers, and change makers who believe that the solutions to most of the world's problems depend on new forms of human cooperation and are therefore also marketing briefs in disguise. We can tackle some of these problems through our day jobs. So at MarketingKind, we coach each other in becoming more conscious leaders through our digital fireside and your MarketingKind gatherings. We can tackle some of them beyond our day jobs through our volunteering efforts. So each month at MarketingKind, we support a different charity or social enterprise in one priority aspect of their marketing and growth. We do this through our Coffee with Cause gatherings and a working group that follows them. Today, later in the conversation, we'll be hearing from the founder of Breaking Barriers, a charity that helps refugees in London to better equip themselves to access and maintain employment, ahead of our Coffee with a Cause with them later this month. And we can partly achieve this across all aspects of our work and lives by seeking to understand and influence the stories that drive the bigger systems and cycles of change that we're a part of. Which brings us perfectly to this evening's theme.
Yeah, so the aim of this evening's conversation is to explore how our inner narratives drive our behaviour and how we might change those inner narratives for positive individual, social, and even societal outcomes. And the concept of story editing that Tim has pioneered has actually been influential behind the scenes at MarketingKind for some time. It's completely transformed my understanding of how we achieve most change in the first place. I spoke earlier in the year, for example, about the charity food cycle and suggested that the value of the food that they provide may ultimately be less significant than the fact that the people they serve their community meals to get to enjoy them in some good company, have something to look forward to each week, rebuild their self-confidence, remind themselves of the value of eating healthily, and bit by bit form a new sense for themselves of what they can make their lives like again. Typically after, for example, multiple bereavements or a period of extreme isolation. And that really gets to the heart of how change becomes self-perpetuating, something we continue for ourselves and that reaches well beyond, in this case, the direct contact that a charity might have with its beneficiaries. Now, just as our own inner narratives drive our individual behaviours, so too, of course, must our collective narratives drive our societal outcomes. In our exchange on resilience earlier in the year, we explored, for example, how even in the case of a disaster or an emergency, history shows that usually the direct and unavoidable impacts of most disasters or emergencies are not as great as the cumulative impacts of the narratives that drive how we anticipate, prepare for, adapt to, respond to, and recover from those disasters. We also saw in our most recent exchange on the path to climate compatible living that we have an awful lot of reimagining how we live and work to do in the coming years, and that we may well need to get much better at adapting our own inner narratives and influencing the narratives of others to be able to cope with the degree of change that we'll be faced with. And I'd say that that is particularly relevant to MarketingKind, because while on the one hand you might see marketing as a department in an organization alongside other departments like finance or operations, we can also see marketing as a narrative-based discipline alongside other narrative-based disciplines, whether that's aspects of psychology or creative writing. So how can we lead on this? And how can we story edit our way to greater success?
We're in just the right company to find out. So here today we have with us Timothy D. Wilson, who is the Cheryl J. Ashton Professor of Psychology at the University of Virginia. Alongside his academic publications, Tim is perhaps best known for his book Redirect, Changing the Stories We Live By. which was described by Malcolm Gladwell as a masterpiece and by Professor Daniel Gilbert of Harvard University as the single most important psychology book ever written. If that wasn't enough, his prior book, Strangers to Ourselves, was listed as one of the best ideas of the year 2002 in the New York Times Magazine. He's published numerous academic articles and books, primarily on the topics of the limits and sources of self-knowledge and the implications of this work for changing behaviour. In 2009, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and to the National Academy of Sciences in 2020. In 2015, the Association for Psychological Science awarded him the William James Fellow Award to honour a lifetime of significant intellectual contributions.
Wonderful. So Tim, perhaps we could start by surfacing some of the key building blocks from Redirect. Maybe to kick us off, do you have a sort of a nutshell definition of story editing, or a brief way to help us understand what the concept is and where the idea comes from?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for those very kind comments and for inviting me to be here. The basic idea, I think, is a pretty straightforward one, that each of us needs to make sense of the world and our place in it. And we do so by developing stories that about ourselves, who we are, why we do what we do, how we fit into the world around us. And the nature of these stories is critical for our well-being and how much we can accomplish our goals. One way I like to think about it is two people can be in the exact same situation. Maybe they're starting a new job, or beginning college, or they're in a relationship that has hit a rough patch. And how they explain that to themselves, the kind of narrative they develop, is crucial to how they react. And they might react in very different ways depending on the kind of narrative they tell themselves. So on a new job, for example, the one who says, I just don't fit in here, I can't make it, this is not for me, versus the other one that says, well, it's hard at first, but I just need to learn how to adapt. Those will lead to very different kinds of behaviors. And as you say, Paul, they can be self-fulfilling. The person who has the negative spin can go down a path where they don't try as hard and don't try to adapt. And the one who has the positive spin can, if they're in a good situation that is responsive to them, their efforts will pay off, and that helps reinforce this positive narrative. So I'm a social psychologist. This is an idea that's been around for a long time. I would say it's not particularly novel, this part of it, that I think many of us would agree that the stories we tell are important. But in recent years, people in my field have found some ways to help people change these narratives that are often fairly straightforward and cheap and not very time consuming, but have big payoffs down the road.
Great, thank you. It's really it's interesting what you say about that personal spin, that personal story about ourselves that we tell ourselves. What more can you say about the nature of that, the nature of our inner narratives, and to what degree they're actually fully formed, or whether we're even consciously aware of them most of the time?
Well, good questions. And I like the story metaphor, but it does, it covers a lot of different kinds of narratives. They can be fairly well-developed core narratives we've developed over many years about the kind of person we are. But they can also be pretty quick assumptions we make about why things are happening to us the way they are. I think they are often not particularly conscious, that people jump to quick conclusions about how well I fit into a particular situation or how other people are reacting to me, what my particular abilities are. That may not be fully formed. In fact, I think these so-called story editing techniques work best when people are in transition periods in their lives and they haven't solidified their story yet. They're sort of open to developing a new story.
So let's dive into that process of change a little bit. I mean, I think I've kind of understood that this process of story editing, the reason it's consequential is because we go from story editing to, and this is my phase, but what you might call reality editing. And you've talked about the fact that those narratives sort of become self-fulfilling to a degree, because if we believe we're good at something, we try hard and maintain our efforts and so on. So it creates that loop. But certainly correct me on that process of how stories become reality, if there's anything that could be enhanced in that. But you talked a little bit there, moving on to these techniques that have emerged in recent years, how we can influence stories. Something I love about story editing is that you're working with people's own agency. If you change their story, you change what they do for themselves. And so maybe we could understand a little bit about the concept of story prompting, because this seems to be not only letting people use their stories for themselves, but actually bring change to their own story rather than have change sort of injected into them through our storytelling. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's a good description of it. And maybe I can explain it best with an example of a study I did many years ago that kind of got me into this whole area. And I noticed as a college professor that new students in college react very different to initial failures. Many people stumble at first. Some people treat it as a barrier to leap over and move forward, and others as a sign they're just not fit for college and they tend to give up. So we did this little study where we had a sample of first-year college students who were not doing that well academically and were worried about their performance. And we brought them into the psychology department, and we never told them that this was an attempt to help them in any way. They thought they were just taking part in a survey. But in our intervention group, we simply gave them some statistics showing that a lot of people get bad grades at first, but it gets better. And they watched videotaped interviews of older students saying, yeah, it was rough for me at first, but I learned to adapt, and now I'm doing just fine. This took about 30 minutes, and we had a control group that also came in, but just did an unrelated task. And then we sat back and just followed these students. And I have to say, even to my surprise, it resulted in the ones who got the intervention got better grades by the end of the year and were less likely to have dropped out of college. How could this have happened with a 30-minute intervention? Well, the key, I think, is what you were saying, Paul, about the self-fulfilling part of it, that I suspect at least what happened is the students who heard this message had been blaming themselves and thinking they were unique in their problems and that this is a sign that they're not college material. But once they heard this is a common problem and that it gets better, maybe they studied a little harder for the next test. This motivated them to go to the professor's office hours and get some help. And that probably paid off on a little better performance, which reinforced this idea that, hey, I can make it here. This place is a place where I can make it. And that built on itself over time, resulting in better performance.
Mm. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a really interesting example. Thank you. So I'm working for a charity. One of the things, and the ethos of what we're trying to do at MarketingKind, one of the things that really stuck out to me from your book was the principle that you describe as do good, be good. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what we can learn from that principle.
Sure. Well, story prompting that you mentioned, Paul, is usually someone else sort of kickstarts the process. So in that case, it was me, the researcher, helping these students start the process of story change. But there are things we can do ourselves without a third party's help. And one of them is this so-called do good, be good principle, which is, it goes by various names. It's part of many 12-step programs of fake it until you make it. And the idea is that if you want to change yourself, ironically, often the first thing to do is to change your behavior first. And that can, again, lead to a self-fulfilling process where I say, oh, that wasn't so bad. And it makes the next step easier. And you begin to revise your story. An example I like to give is I consider myself a pretty introverted person. I don't find parties all that easy to navigate and meet new people. But at one point I decided, maybe I'm just not trying hard enough, and I'm just going to pretend I'm an extrovert for the next party I go to. And I'm going to go up to people I don't know and start a conversation. And it wasn't easy for me, but it turns out, I could do it. And each time I did, I think of myself as a little less of an introvert now. And it started this process of change. And there's some good research on this with adolescents, where one way to help adolescents who are disengaged in their community is to get them to do volunteer work. And, it's on the face of it, that seems, well, what does doing volunteer work have to do with adolescent behavior problems? But I think in this particular program I'm thinking of, they give the teens some choice as to the kind of volunteer work they want to do. They can choose whether to work in a soup kitchen or an old folks home, and they commit to doing a couple hours a week. And again, I think what happens is they begin to change their image of themselves as a result of helping other people. They view themselves as more engaged in their community, as someone who is doing something for someone else. And that process over time helps them adapt better. And in fact, these studies show that teens who do this are less apt to get into trouble in other ways and do better in school.
There's a very nice line in Strangers to Ourselves when you write that we all have the capability to act a little bit more like the person we want to become. And I think this do good, be good principle really reveals the power behind that. Now, I want to turn to something that actually for me was a little challenging because it goes against something that I like, which is common sense. And it did so very effectively, which was troubling to me. So if every book or every story, I guess, has its bad guy, and my sense of the bad guy in Redirect is relying on common sense. So maybe you could unpick a little bit for us why common sense is something that's dangerous to rely on when it comes to story editing, and why a sort of robust, empirical, rigorous approach to testing is so crucial for getting it right.
Sure. Well, this is kind of a sub-theme of the book that, psychology is a funny discipline because unlike other sciences, people bring a whole host of assumptions with them about the answer to what people are like. Most nuclear physicists don't have to combat common sense about what quarks are. They just do their research. But we psychologists, there's a lot of common wisdom, and a lot of it's correct. I don't mean to say common sense is always wrong. But I think it can be dangerous to translate it into interventions that we assume will help people without doing the rigorous work of testing to see if it does. So, one example I start the book with is this approach called critical incident stress debriefing, which is very common in the United States, at least, as a way of dealing with people who have witnessed some trauma. For example, first responders who have witnessed some terrible accident are asked to, as soon as possible after the event, to relive it in their minds, to talk about exactly what they experienced with the help of a counselor. And that kind of makes sense, that to purge yourself of your feelings would help you adapt to this event. And it's in fact mandatory in some police and fire departments. But psychologists got around to testing this with a well-controlled, random controlled trial where some people are randomly assigned to go through this and others not. And it turns out not only does it not work, there's some evidence that actually does more harm than good. That it solidifies memories for this trauma that people would have kind of dropped out of memory. And it makes it harder to recover from these events. And there's many examples of this. I draw an analogy in the book to the medical field where most of us, I think, would agree. I pause here in this age of anti-vaxxers, but most of us would agree that to let science test medical treatments And we'd be skeptical of someone who said they invented a cure for COVID in their basement, or without testing it. And yet we don't have that same mindset for psychological interventions. We often tend to think common sense is enough. And I just think we have to do that hard work of putting these things to the test.
I mean, it's a very sobering example and it's a really, really good point. But selfishly, I come back to my field, my background, and I wonder about if you were running a small charity, for example, that doesn't have much time or resource for formal testing. Obviously, we still need to do rigorous testing, but the resources can be much more limited. Do you think there are any ways that we can still incorporate story editing safely and ethically?
Well, it's a really good question. I've thought a lot about it, and I don't know that I have the answer. I mean, one thing that struck me is that my field of social psychology hasn't done a great job of helping in these kinds of situations, of having an applied branch that that people can turn to help them with these kinds of tests. And if you think again of other science, like physics has an applied side of engineering, people who know how to build bridges and actually put things to work in the real world. And I think my field is increasingly doing this, but it does take resources. It does take some know-how. In my town of Charlottesville, Virginia, each year our city council takes requests from charities for funding, and increasingly they're asking for evidence-based that their approaches work. But it does, particularly a small charity, it does put them in a bind of how do I actually do it? And not everyone can do a good random controlled trial with lots of participants. So I'm not entirely against using common sense. I think if it's based on other approaches that we are pretty sure work. And there are people, if you're running a food kitchen and people need to eat, you don't want to wait to do a random controlled trial to see how to give them food. You need to solve problems quickly. So, there is a bit of a dilemma there, but I blame my own field in part for not being more available to help in these situations.
You mentioned a moment ago the critical incident stress debriefings, and as a little aside, and to show how influential you've been over our thinking at MarketingKind, actually, I was supporting a chief of police in the US, so I won't say the state, and he first of all confirmed that critical incident stress debriefings are useless. And that gave me a good entry point for recommending redirect to him. And specifically, he was trying to take a very progressive approach to policing, and doing so during the Black Lives Matter protests. And so the reason I'd recommended your book was that he was trying to find the right ways to take a very progressive approach with his officers, while at the same time overcoming their instincts to think, are you attacking us as a police force? Are you on our side? And so I recommended that he look into redirect to see if there were ways to engage his officers in seeing themselves as members of their local community first, and that being the sort of main identifier in building that community spirit that way. Now, one question that I have is, to what degree can we use story editing ourselves to improve our own sort of happiness and well-being, or to what degree does sort of knowing the trick make it ineffective, if that makes sense?
Well, another good question, and I think simply reminding ourselves that and particularly if we're in a situation where we're not happy with our story, maybe we're in a relationship that is troubled and we have a particular spin on it. that just reminding yourselves that's one spin, and it's not necessarily the only one, may not be the accurate one, or there's certainly probably a more positive one I can put on it. But even beyond that, there are, as I talk about in the book, various writing exercises people can do to further their narratives. There's a social psychologist named James Pennebaker who pioneered expressive writing, where people, if something is troubling them, and particularly if it's something that some time has passed and they still can't quite get over it, it's a relationship problem or some traumatic event that has occurred to them that is preying on them, they are troubled by it. He has this writing exercise where people are asked to just take out a piece of paper and write down all their thoughts and feelings about it. Don't worry about grammar or writing, just spill it out, and do that for maybe 10, 15 minutes, 3-4 nights in a row. And it's hard and often upsetting to actually do. And the studies he does on this, people find it difficult. Sometimes they cry as they think about these events. So it seems like, why are you forcing people? I mean, like critical incident stress debriefing, you are getting people to focus on it. But the difference is, first of all, you're letting some time pass. And you're doing it in a way that what typically happens is people start out writing fairly jumbled, not particularly coherent thoughts about the thing that's troubling them. But over the course of the writing, they develop a new narrative. They find a different meaning in the event. They're able to tie it up in a way where they don't think about it as much. And Pennebaker has found in a lot of random controlled trials that people who do this, students get better grades, employees show up to work more, people's health improves. It's a remarkable way to move beyond and find meaning in an event that we previously couldn't make sense of.
Really interesting and really powerful. And maybe building on that, what are the writing practices or other writing practices associated with story editing?
Well, there's a more recent one that's similar to the Pennebaker one, but they specifically asked people to take a third-person perspective on themselves. So, and to think about why they felt the way they did. So in one study, they asked people to recall an event that really made them angry. And people thought about disputes with bosses and things of that sort. And some people were just asked to sort of relive it in their minds. But others were asked to write about it in a third-person perspective. So if it was me, I would say, okay, Tim said this, his boss said that, and then Tim did this. And specifically to think about why the event occurred. And that seemed to help people, again, move beyond it, to find, by gaining that third-person perspective, to be able to reinterpret the event in a way that change their view of it, and usually in a way that helped them move beyond. So they might have said, well, now that I look at it in this way, I see that maybe I was a little bit to blame here too, and there were two sides to this, and it's time to put this behind me and move on.
It actually raises the question in my mind of the degree to which these writing exercises that you describe, is it that we should be doing them at particular moments? Because you talk about particular times when there's something that it's hard for us to process or move on from or be confident in, or is it something that we should be doing or could make use of at any point in our lives? And maybe to throw two things at you at once, because you're far too good at answering one question at a time. But you write a lot about meaning, hope, and purpose. And I wonder, is there a sense in which purpose is even more important to our well-being than happiness, if that makes sense?
Well, I think it's a critical ingredient to happiness, that people who feel a sense of they have some goal they're pursuing and they're making progress to it is really important to feeling happy with who they are and what they're doing. Yeah, I mean, that I think is, the meaning, hope, and purpose are sort of the ingredients of happiness in my book. But your other question about timing, I think there's a lot we don't know about this, but I do think it's critical as to when we write about things. As I mentioned, I think right after something bad's happened to us is not the best time to do it. We're just too emotional. We're in a relationship, say, and find out our partner has just left us. You don't want to take out a piece of paper and write then. I think it's just too upsetting and you're too heartbroken. Best to distract yourself and go out and have a drink with your friends or whatever. But after a couple of weeks, 2-3 weeks, 4, if you still can't, it's still really troubling you, but you can gain a little perspective. That's the time when writing, I think, can really help.
Thank you. That's really, I'm scribbling down in the background some really useful and fascinating insights there, especially in terms of us personally. But it'd be great to sort of zoom out a little bit and look at some of the big picture side of things, especially in terms of what some of our attendees will be thinking about. So I wonder, how might a story editing approach differ to a conventional approach to dealing with a social challenge such as youth violence? Well,
I think the difference is that, again, it focuses on how the teens are interpreting what you're doing, and not just throwing something at them that you think will make them better. Again, in the United States, at least, one of the biggest failures in this approach are these so-called scared straight programs, where kids who are at risk for committing violence are taken to a prison, and they are interviewed and confronted by hardened criminals who try to scare them out of a life of crime, basically. This became very popular in the States. There was a documentary about it. But again, once it was tested, it turned out it actually did more harm than good. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. It turns out one of the worst things you can do with at-risk teens is bring them together, where they want to impress each other more than the adults who are trying to help them. So, approaches that think about it through their eyes. Why are they, how engaged do they feel in their community, and how are they feeling about their own lives and the adults, and trying to think about ways of transforming those stories is bound to be more successful.
A lot of the challenges that we face today, I see as sort of, we come up against the in-group versus out-group problem. When we think about the climate emergency, for example, and an optimal response on the climate emergency involves us having some degree of concern for people not only that are not in our in-group, but people that we don't know, will never know, we won't see what happens to them as a result of our actions. Is there a way that story editing might help us overcome some of these sort of identity challenges of we are this group and they are that group?
Yeah. Well, that's a big one, and I don't have a magic bullet, but I think it's certainly something social psychologists have thought about, in intergroup conflict of different racial groups, different political groups. There are some techniques. In the case, this doesn't work so much with climate change in future generations, but in the case of existing groups that are in conflict, bringing them together to mutually cooperate for the same goal, cooperative learning techniques, where you break down barriers by giving people a shared purpose. There's plenty of studies that support that. Implementing it in the real world is a challenge. You can't sort of magically make people come together and share a goal. There are some approach. One thing our stories are very sensitive to is how are other people thinking? We're such social creatures that we're very attuned to our beliefs about whether others share my opinions and what others want me to do. And trying to change those norms or people's perceptions of the norms can be one way to get at some of this. Maybe my peers aren't as hostile to others as I think they are, or this has been used with substance abuse like alcohol, that maybe my peers aren't drinking as much as I think they are, and correcting those kinds of beliefs is one route to change. But again, no magic bullets from me today. Climate change is a really fascinating one because at least in polls I've seen recently, and at least in the United States, a surprising percentage of people actually now believe that it's a real problem. I think we've had some success in changing people's views that we do have a crisis. But what do we do about it as an individual? I mean, clearly there's much that needs to be done structurally and with industry and so on. But for we as individuals, what is our solution? And I think stories play a role here, that people, this is my sense and I'll use myself as an example that I've always been a dedicated recycler. I have bins in which I put my bottles and cans and cardboard. And that makes me feel kind of self-righteous. I'm helping the environment. I'm doing my part. And maybe it doesn't matter that I'm actually driving my car, a lot. But it turns out, recycling doesn't change things very much, at least as it currently exists. And educating people about what does, I've actually done a little research on this, that many people don't realize one of the single ways we most contribute to climate change is through our diet, and particularly eating meat. And first of all, many people don't know that. But once they do, you're up against stories about, becoming a vegetarian or a vegan is hard for a lot of people because of these labels that it seems like this drastic step. And I think we need some work there to sort of revise that story to, well, you don't have to switch from a meat eater to a vegetarian. There's lots of gradations. You can skip meat once a week to start with. You can find new recipes for wonderful vegetarian food. So I've gone on so long about this, but I think there's room for some story editing there.
Sparked so many interesting thoughts in my head, and hopefully Paul can help me organise them. But one thing that's slightly on a negative front, sadly, through my work at Mind, I've come across this directly on the climate change front, that 56% of young people believe that humanity is doomed. I mean, it's quite a depressing stat in itself. But the mental health of children and young people is a key pillar of our strategy. Something I personally was thinking about in terms of what you were saying there is how can we address that mental health issue of feeling like young people feel like they have no control over their destiny? Can story editing help with eco-anxiety, for example?
Well, one thing I want to make clear is that I don't think these kinds of story editing techniques are a replacement for psychotherapy. For someone who's really distressed and is suffering from depression and anxiety, I am a big fan of psychotherapy, and particularly, some forms of psychotherapy like cognitive behavioral therapy are sort of ramped up story editing. I mean, it's a way to change people's negative thought patterns. But short of that, maybe the be good principle here of getting young people involved and showing they can make a difference in their community. Maybe it's a small way, but it's a community garden, something they can get involved in, connects them with other people. That might help some.
Definitely.
It's interesting that Tim, that you related this, the climate emergency and the overlooked priority of changes to our pattern of eating, because having enjoyed Redirect several times, I happen to know that the origins of story editing were in World War II, and the need to persuade people to use organ meats that perhaps people weren't familiar with eating previously. And so maybe there's an approach now to sort of coming back full circle and actually using story editing to engage people in becoming, you didn't quite use the word flexitarian, but in realizing that you can eat less meat, you don't necessarily go to 100% meat free, and that everyone can make a difference. I don't know if there's more you might like to say on how we might go about
that. I love that connection. I hadn't actually made it myself of coming full circle to that original study, but I love that connection. And I think the labels we give ourselves are important. What I've heard lately is having a plant-based diet. It doesn't mean you don't eat meat, it's that you're more plant-based. At my university, there's a group that calls themselves bad vegans, which means that they're kind of vegans, but they have a hamburger sometimes, and they're quite upfront about this. So, we don't have to be so strict. So, I think that, these labels can guide narratives in important ways.
Thank you. It's really interesting. One other thing that was sparked when when Paul asked you the original question around in-group versus out-group mindset is around some of the work I'm actively involved in as part of my day job on racial equity and inclusion. I mean, sadly, it's still an extremely important challenge and one that many in our community are working on. You had some brilliant cases in Redirect relating to school and college environments, really interesting examples. But I wonder, are there any good examples of using story editing to address these challenges in adult or work environments? I mean, one thing, just to follow on from that we're talking a lot about, but I'm unsure about, is unconscious bias training. I mean, does that align with story editing, or is that common sense trap potentially?
Well, I certainly do believe in implicit bias. That is something my field has investigated now for 20 years, that bias can exist at many levels. And, tragically, there's still a lot of very explicit prejudice and racism out there. But even amongst the well-intentioned, there can be more implicit, less conscious bias that can be quite insidious. And this is one of the hottest topics in my field right now, is to how to change that or how to deal with it. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations have responded with implicit training bias workshops, exercises. Unfortunately, there's not much evidence that they work very well. I mean, if you think about it, if you have a habitual way of responding to another group in a negative way, why would we expect a 30-minute training exercise to undo that? It's not that easy, unfortunately. But there are some promising hints of things that might work. Again, I think cooperative learning techniques in education, and I think some of those are applicable to business, where you have groups of diverse people work on a problem together, and they're dependent on each other for succeeding. They have to cooperate and share a goal. That's been found to break down barriers. Communicating social norms. There's a recent study on a college campus that just communicating that most people on this campus are in favor of diversity came to news to people and made them chill a little bit and act in more egalitarian ways. So again, no magic bullets, but I think we're working on it.
Right.
I was listening to an interview with the historian Yuval Noah Harari a few days ago. And one of the first questions that came up in the interview was, what are the origins of racism? And it made me think of you and your work, Tim. So I made a note of his response. He said, racism comes from the human mind. It comes from the stories we tell ourselves and each other, and it does not come from the outside world. And he cited the evidence that, for example, there's no evidence that chimpanzees exercise any discriminatory behavior based on hair color, for example. And I think that was just such a powerful reminder of the degree to which so many of these problems really come down to the stories that we're telling ourselves. To what degree we're aware of that will vary, but those stories are just so powerful.
I think that's true. Paul, if I can just give one caveat that always makes me a little nervous here, is that as much as I believe that, I worry some people will interpret that to mean we don't need structural change. If it's something that's just inside our heads, then we just need to change that and all racism will disappear. And, you know, there is a lot of structural racism out there that needs to be addressed head on. But I think that these two things aren't independent, that even if you change the situation and make things more egalitarian, people's stories have to fall in line with that as well.
And I think we might come back even a little bit more to unpicking the sort of story editing underpinnings to some of the sort of structural consequences that come from those. But so I was probably jumping over Emma.
No, that sounds great. Go on.
So Tim, if we look across society, let's start to try and be able to see the world through the eyes of a good story editor. So if we look across society, who would you say is sort of just naturally good at story editing? Where might we find them? Are there sort of accidental versions of story editing? I mean, is it just the case that the examples you're talking about are intentional, but actually we're story editing each other all the time? And so how might we kind of see through the eyes of a good story editor?
Interesting question. To answer that, I have to reveal my political preferences and my frustration. It's always struck me that conservatives in the United States are better at story editing than liberals and Democrats. And as a liberal and Democrat, I get very frustrated by that, of convincing their followers that of a particular narrative about what cures COVID, for example, and what doesn't work, giving names to things, often extreme, but ways that get their followers to buy into it. And in the United States, at least, Democrats just seem it's a more diverse group that just doesn't seem to be as good at messaging, and that's always been my impression. And I think it's a matter of controlling the narrative, which is not a new thought, but there are some political leaders who are better at that than others. In terms of other examples, I guess that's the main one that is a depressing one to me, but it's the main one that comes to mind.
There's one example that occurred to me recently, actually, which I wanted to put to you to see if this would count, because it's not really a story per se, but we recently did an exchange on climate compatible living, and one of our guests was Joan Fitzgerald, who is a world expert in how cities become sustainable. And preparing for that, I came across some research that showed that there was a real problem, actually it was a US problem, of public officials intentionally putting unpleasant looking, drab looking fixtures and fittings in public transit, in buses and so on. And they were doing that in order to avoid the appearance of having wasted taxpayer or public funding, even though better looking fixtures wouldn't have actually cost more. But as a negative result, the particular author claimed, it created a sense that if you're on that bus, you're a bit of a loser. that is not a cool thing to do. And so actually it was sort of very counterproductive when what you would want to induce as a self-narrative is that, collective transit is smarter, more fun, more chances of meeting someone interesting, and more environmentally friendly. So could there be sort of examples of story editing that are just embedded in the way that we go about life?
I love that example. It makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of a similar case in my town where, I live in a fairly small town and public transportation kind of struggles to attract enough riders. At one point, they took one of the routes, and instead of having a bus go on it, it was a bus that looked like a British trolley. I mean, it was still a bus, but it kind of looked like a trolley. And more people rode it. It was fun to ride a trolley than a bus. Sort of fit, for the same reasons. I think they associated buses with lower class people who couldn't afford cars. But there was more cachet to riding a trolley, even though it was really a bus. I think those kind of things. Often they're unintentional, but humans are just so good at picking up these cues of what this means for me. What does it mean for the kind of person I am? What are other people doing? That when those are manipulated in clever ways, that they can be powerful.
Yeah, there's so much to pick up on there. Hopefully we can do later on. And there's some interesting conversations in the chat as well we can mention later, but in terms of that politician point. But I wonder if we can end this section by asking a question back about ourselves. So what more can we do to build our story editing reflexes in our own lives and ways of working?
Well, I think we've covered the main ones, the do good, be good principle, these writing exercises. And again, I think just reminding ourselves that we tend to think our view of the world is a reflection of objective reality, and just reminding ourselves that all of us are spinning, all of us are interpreting and putting our particular spin on what's happening to us. And just that realization, I think, makes them more fungible. And maybe there's some work that I can do to change that story.
So Emma mentioned earlier that Emma mentioned a couple of good things. So in terms of the chat and the Q&A, just a reminder to everyone, if you can make your comments visible to everyone if you select the option, otherwise it's just for the panelists. And also a reminder to everyone to put questions in the Q&A function, because we'll have some questions that we already have and some live questions from everybody who's with us this evening in a few minutes. But first of all, the other good thing that Emma mentioned is that every month we have a coffee with a cause gathering at MarketingKind, where we support a particular charity with a priority aspect of their marketing. And this month we're delighted to be working with Matthew Powell and Breaking Barriers, which is a marvelous charity which supports refugees in London in better preparing for accessing and maintaining employment. And my sense actually is that I can already start to see connections as to how story editing might relate to how we might be able to support Breaking Barriers. But Matthew, thank you for joining us. Maybe you could give us a sense of what Breaking Barriers is and how we may be able to help.
Thanks very much, Paul. So a very quick introduction about the charity. We are an organisation that I set up about 6 years ago to address the significantly higher than average unemployment levels for refugees. So in the UK, so to give you an idea of scale, 400,000 plus refugees in the country, and despite high levels of education, unemployment levels are very high. And one of the main reasons for that is due to the asylum process, so that period that you're waiting to get your refugee status, where you're A, not able to work, and B, it's a very lengthy process. The longest I've seen is 25 years. So I'm sure you can imagine how challenging that is to find work after going through that process. So we proactively work with businesses to develop alternative recruitment pathways. So we work with a range of multinational companies across the UK to support people into their businesses. But one of the really key elements of our work with those organizations, but with the general public as well, is changing the narrative around refugees and creating a much more positive image in what is quite a hostile environment in the press and various political parties. So in terms of how organizations and individuals can support, obviously, if you're a business leader, please do reach out, and we'd love to discuss how we could work with your business. But as marketeers, we would love to get your support. And I guess through the Coffee with a Cause session next week, we'd love to discuss how you can help us better tell stories to market our work and to elevate what we're doing.
It's a wonderful opportunity, and my sense is that nobody can better tell the story of enterprise than and the potential that it has to help people rebuild their lives than a refugee. So I recommend to all of our members, please do join our Coffee with a Cause gathering with Breaking Barriers. It's Friday the 26th, next, not this Friday, but the one after, as Matthew says, 11 o'clock to 12:30. There'll be a working group that follows. If you're not a MarketingKind member, then there's still time before then to correct that. And if you are not able to correct that, but there is some support that you can offer through your business or otherwise for Breaking Barriers, please do get in touch with us, and we will connect you with Matthew and his team. So I'm looking forward to joining it. I'm starting to get ideas thanks to Tim. And so I look forward to seeing you again, Matthew, in just a few days' time. I also want to take a moment to recommend the book that will tell you even more about story editing. So Tim's book, Redirect, Changing the Stories That We Live By. A couple of things I've rediscovered in preparing for this evening. First of all, I read this again, and what I'd remembered how brilliant it was. It was actually one of our founding members, Rory Sutherland, who said it was the best book that he'd read for a year when he recommended it to me. But I'd forgotten how entertainingly written it was, as well as a great idea. And, you know, the passage where you debunk self-help books like The Secret is just absolutely hilarious. And I also want to recommend, I've been listening to it as an audiobook, Tim's prior book, Strangers to Ourselves, which I think is one of the most profound books that I've ever come across. So I absolutely love it. We're going to turn and include some live questions and some questions that were sent to us in advance. But a couple of things that occurred to me. So firstly, we talked quite a bit about purpose earlier, and all of our community is interested in purpose. You know, to what degree does our purpose and intentionality come from our non-conscious mind, or to what degree does it come from our conscious mind? And how might we reconcile the two so that they're working together?
Well, you're asking some tough questions. I think there is some research on the goals we have in life and how important they are to us. Such things as how much we value achievement versus affiliation versus other goals. And there are ways of measuring those both non-consciously and consciously. And what's fascinating is they are sometimes out of sync. You know, people may have a strong need for achievement at one level, but not recognize that at a more conscious level. And that can be problematic if it's our conscious selves choosing our profession or what activities to do, but it's not satisfying this need that's less conscious. That's not a good state to be in. And how to correct it? Well, again, I think, being good observers of ourselves, noting that, as much as we think we want this career path, it just doesn't seem like a good fit. Just trying to, that we are strangers to ourselves, and we have to look at ourselves from the outside sometimes and see, my behavior isn't matching up with what I think I want to do. And perhaps even at least questioning whether we're on the right path in terms of purpose.
Yeah, I was sharing a pet theory that occurred to me over the last few days preparing for this discussion with Tim just before we went live. And so, of course, strangers to ourselves, one of the premises is that it's surprisingly difficult to know simple things about ourselves, like, you know, what is our personality like, and can be, you know, sometimes easier to spot those characteristics in a stranger. And the thought had occurred to me that, you know, maybe one reason for that is that it's easier to find points of comparison in other people. So in welcoming Tim this evening, I know what it's like to have welcomed former guests to exchanges. So I can very easily see salient characteristics, whereas every damn time that I've done an exchange, I've been in my own head. I've never had the opportunity to be in a guest's head or to be in Anna's head or Emma's head. And so it just makes it difficult. That quick and easy comparison mechanism just isn't available to us. So I don't know how that sits with you, Tim. As a
I think it's a really interesting test. It's a really interesting point. And you know, a variation of that is we get to view other people in a variety of situations. You know, I can see how my friends react when they're in small groups, how they react when they're at professional meetings or whatever. And it can sort of track, you know, what's their different responses to different situations. But as you say, we're always constant. We're always sort of self-focused, and we're less attentive to those situational differences, which I think it can make it harder to read how we react in different situations.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it makes me think back to what you were saying about the writing exercise around the third person perspective, with someone in the chat also talked about how valuable that is. And it makes me think, how do we, you know, building on that, how do we protect ourselves from malign influences on our inner narratives? So, I mean, currently there's so much more in the press around fake news, etc., cognitive warfare, you know, the battle for the brain. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, not profound ones, I don't think. I mean, it's, you know, I've been, like many people, pretty disturbed about how social media contributes to this and channels us down into ways that seem to reinforce fake news in some cases. You know, I decry the lack of influence of journalism, and, you know, good journalists are good arbiters of what's true and isn't, but I think that's, you know, they're having less impact as people are getting their news not from established sources, but from you know, something they find on the internet. And you know, I know a lot of the social media companies are actively working on this, you know, how to filter out fake news, and I hope they have more success than they've had so far. Yeah, I'm reminded of a cartoon I saw recently where there's a guy sitting at a computer and he's saying to his wife, "Honey, I just discovered something on the internet that all the scientists of the world miss." And, you know, I think that's kind of where we are. People take something they found and assume they know more than the experts, which, I mean, I'm just restating the problem without offering solutions, but I'm not sure I have big ones at this point.
To restate the problem without solutions again, I'd say this is just something that comes up so regularly at MarketingKind. We had a guest earlier in the year who was formerly the UK Sustainable Development Commissioner, and he talked about the sort of effectively how consumerism gaslights us into thinking that we need to buy ever more stuff to be happy. We did some work with the a defense think tank on, you know, this notion of cognitive warfare, and that increasingly in the future states may, as has happened already, deliberately intervene primarily just to sow lots of seeds of doubt in the domestic population of a rival nation. And so I think sort of protecting ourselves from wrong narratives, and of course a lot of people have been exposed to conspiracy theories and so on during the pandemic, just with the extra degree of isolation. So I think that is such a big challenge to address. Something else, though, that occurs to me. Every day I meditate in the morning and completely clear my head of stories, or certainly use a technique that helps me towards clearing my head of stories. And sometimes I'll repeat that during the day, particularly if I've been assimilating a lot of different information. I might stop and meditate. And then afterwards, a much more powerful and coherent story sort of emerges from the, it's not something I can intentionally do, but it emerges and I can process it consciously. Now, there are all sorts of narratives on this. So you have spiritual traditions that have, will explain it in terms of achieving a sort of fundamental level of integration that isn't available in normal consciousness. Or you might have sort of physiological descriptions like Antonio Damasio, the neuroscientist, talking about the chance to sort of dwell in our own sort of physiological regulatory systems. Do you have a take on what happens when we meditate and why our stories might just sort of emerge in a healthier place afterwards?
Well, anything that resets us, I think that can interrupt the current narrative. And I think meditation is certainly one way that for people who have an affinity for that approach. I'm more of a distractor. I need to go exercise or take a walk, take my dog out and just get my mind on something else as a way of resetting. But I think, it's just, the worst kind of state is to be in a ruminative state where we're in a sort of a negative thought cycle and this thing seem much worse than they actually are, and we keep reinforcing that thought. And again, just interrupting that cycle, however you can, is a good thing.
Sort of brings on to how we interrupt that cycle, but also how we figure out when protecting our narrative is a good thing or when it's a bad thing. So I think in the book you described a psychological immune system that protects our narratives, it helps us. But how does that work? Like, when is it a friend and when is it our foe?
Well, I like this term, psychological immune system, and it's a very useful set of processes the brain has to defend itself against negative information, to put positive spins on things that might be threatening to us. And, it's a two-edged sword, though, because it keeps us going and gives us a more optimistic view of ourselves, which can be very important. But it can also lead to denial of things we might be responsible for. It's not necessarily a good trait we want to see in our leaders, where they are just explaining away bad things. Oh, it's not my fault. This is actually a good thing that I did. But at a personal level, a little bit of spinning negative things into positive things probably serves us well.
Sorry, go on, Paul.
Just on the topic of spinning a negative thing into a positive thing. So to continue with the theme of shallow and easy to answer questions. So I have a problem, which is I'm not going to live forever. I'm actually not that important. And most of the time, I don't know what's coming next. Is there anything that narrative can do to help me get on the right side of that problem?
Yeah, that's funny. Another huge debate in my field is how much self-enhancement and self-distortion is a good thing or not. And there's a raging debate on this. There are those who feel, in the mental health field in particular, that we need to achieve an accurate view of ourselves as possible. That's a sign of mental health. But I think, I guess I'm of the persuasion that particularly the big questions that you mentioned, that we are mortal beings. We don't need to be reminded of that every day and think, we need to live our lives and work towards our goals. I suspect another one is we all exaggerate. Maybe you said this, but we all exaggerate our importance in the world a bit. I've always wanted to do a study, for example, of ask me how much do I think my friends think about me. Take my kid. I have 2 adult children. How much do they actually think about me when I'm not around? I said, well, yeah, they probably do, fairly often. If we actually ask them, I suspect they're living their lives, not thinking about their dad all that much. But is that a bad thing that I think that? It keeps me going, makes me think I'm an effective person. So a little bit of that kind of enhancement probably is a good thing.
Links neatly on actually to potentially to one of the questions that we've got, and also some of the chat, which is really interesting, the commentary there. One of our attendees has asked, how can we use this, and by this might be from a few questions back, but how can we use this to support young people as they begin their journey into the adult world?
Well, it's a nice question, because I do think that these kinds of techniques are especially important at transition periods where people don't have a solid narrative yet as to who they are. And people in their teens or young adults are certainly, I think, many in that category of sort of figuring out who they are and what their role is. And, I think as a parent, I have a chapter on parenting in my book, in that, it's a tricky enterprise, but you want to steer our kids in ways without doing it with a heavy hand. Now, I think the worst thing we can do is be too controlling, where they either with rewards or punishments, where our kids end up feeling that they don't have their own narrative. They're just under the influence of adults controlling them. We don't want to go to the opposite extreme, where we just leave our kids to do whatever they want with no supervision. So, it's a tricky middle ground where we want to help them find their narrative and support them in doing it, whereas nudging them in off negative paths into positive ones is the best we can. And that's not always easy, but I do think I see many parents err on the controlling side, where they think their job is to do everything for their child. And I don't think that is a good way to help them develop a sense of autonomy and have good narratives for who they are.
So another problem that I might have is that I've been through a lot of processes of change, but probably they've mostly come to an end now. So my question, as you might have guessed, is what is the end of history illusion? And are there ways that we can overcome it?
Well, that's some work that my colleague Daniel Gilbert and his students did that I was part of, that where we do have this sense at most points of our lives that we're done changing. But in fact, we're not. In fact, we do tend to develop our preferences and attitudes. So, just a mundane example, if you ask people, what's your favorite band? And do you think that'll be your favorite band 10 years from now? People say, yeah, probably. I'll be the same person 10 years from now. Well, in fact, we'll have a new favorite band more than likely in 10 years. And, I think there's a little work on narratives through the lifespan, and they do continue to change. And, I'm in an age where I see many of my colleagues think about retirement, and that's a big one for, talk about a narrative change from something you've been pursuing for years to deciding maybe you want to try, a totally different path. And I see many people struggle with that one, is to how to change their narrative. Paul, you probably haven't finished changing is the answer.
Really interesting. And I mean, there's a question from the audience I'll ask you in a second, but it really makes me think back to that point you made around parenting, and I can imagine, and it has happened to teenage me many, many years ago, saying, you will continue to change, you will continue to evolve. And me saying, no, I am who I am. I'm fully formed. Try telling a teenager that. Yeah, it's a very difficult one. But a question from Humphrey in the chat is, marketeers try to create narratives as if the brand they represent has a personality of its own. Does this inherently distance people from responsibility for corporate behaviour? And if so, great question, and if so, are brands bad, but why do we love them?
I have a feeling that's more of a question for you folks than me, but I mean, my sense, not being a marketer, is that that is an important goal of marketing, but it's we don't become slaves to these things. I assume that's what the questioner means. This is bad in the sense that it's very controlling. I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm thinking of the example of people who prefer name brands over generics when they're the identical products. That's not such a good narrative, that you're paying twice as much for a painkiller that has a name brand versus a generic. On the list of the world's ills, I wouldn't rate that the highest, but it's probably not great.
My sense from the question is it kind of raises the idea of, can sometimes a brand, because essentially they're drawing a distinction between a parent company and brands that parent company that might own, that might have narratives that in some way, where the brand becomes a sort of alter ego, where the parent company, the brand is maybe talking positively about particular social issues, while the parent company is avoiding paying the taxes that might actually address those social issues. So I think what's interesting is if those narratives sort of become entangled, and that's something I wanted to raise anyway, actually, is there a process that we can use when our narratives tangle up in each other? And I give we can think of personal examples, I guess, but one public example over here that I spotted earlier in the pandemic, after one of the lockdowns here, at one and the same time, the government had been working on legislation to fight obesity by banning 2-for-1 offers on food and in hospitality. But at the same time, to help the hospitality sector emerge from the lockdown, which has of course been awful for hospitality, and we've had extensive lockdowns here, the government did a Eat Out to Help Out scheme, whereby if you went out and bought 2 meals, the restaurant, any participating restaurant, could have one of those meals refunded by the government, and you would only have to pay for one of them yourself. And so it was to stimulate interest in hospitality. But effectively, what that meant was the government was trying to ban 2-for-1, but subsidizing half price. And of course, any basic mathematician will see that there's an identity between those two things. And so, competing priorities today can leave us sort of entangled. I want to be eco-friendly, but I also want to do something that's easy. I want to be progressive in a particular way, but I also want to do what I'm used to and comfortable with. So is there anything that we can do to better disentangle ourselves when we have narratives that are actively locked up in each other?
Well, those are nice examples. And, I think in the States and elsewhere, just at a broader level, that just the tension between promoting health versus promoting economic growth is all sorts of conflicts with the pandemic. I think the best I can say there is just pointing them out. I mean, are people aware of the conflict to start with, and knowing that there are opposing goals here, and this particular choice of whether to eat out is which goal is more important to me in this particular case. But I guess awareness is the first step, that there are these competing narratives.
Good point. I mean, how can we become more aware of these external, but also our own internal inner narratives?
Well, it's a hard question because as I think you mentioned earlier, they're not entirely conscious. I think narratives can become ingrained in ways that become kind of automatic, and we respond automatically in a situation. I'm thinking of an older study of adolescents at a summer camp for troubled youth in the States, and they observed when the kids acted aggressively, and they found there were specific things that triggered aggression in each child, but they were very different. One might be an insult from a fellow child, one might be a comment from a camp counselor. They were very regular at the individual level, but very different across individuals. It was like they had these automatic triggers. But I doubt the kids had much awareness of what those triggers were. And again, I think the best I can offer there is being really good observers of ourselves, seeing what our triggers are, what causes us to get angry or happy in a particular situation. And just as we observe other people, sometimes we have to be observers of ourselves.
Is there anything that we can do when practicing that to sort of become, to better befriend our own thinking processes? I think I might be right. Were you also behind the quite sort of famous research that showed that, plenty of people would actually rather receive an electric shock than be left with their own thoughts? And is there what might we do to better befriend our own thinking processes?
Yeah, I plead guilty on that study. I think we've done some work there where I think it's practice, first of all, that sort of giving people more experience with how to harness their own thoughts, things they like to think about. Making it easier or less challenging task. But I do think diaries of this, keeping track of our reactions and situations. It's hard to live our lives and observe ourselves completely as well. But if there's a particular problem we're worried about, of a relationship at work, or some pattern that we think we might be seeing, just keeping a simple diary of how we react in different situations can be helpful, just to detect what the pattern is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What a big question in the Q&A here. Building on that, so does not being an observer of yourself lead to unethical behavior?
Well, I don't think necessarily. I think we'd have to assume that someone had an initial tendency to act in some ethical way, and by failing to observe ourselves, we don't keep it in check. But I think for most of us, I'm actually thinking of one study, if I remember it correctly, that gave people the chance to be cooperative towards another person or act competitively, and they made them respond really quickly or slowly so they could think about it. And in that study, people are actually more cooperative when they responded quickly. It was after they sort of reflected about it, said, wait a minute, maybe I should take more of the money and give less to the other person. So I don't think that our initial impulses are always evil, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
This is, for me, this whole topic is just one of the most important things that we could ever be talking about. There's, I believe, a Nobel Prize-winning economist who essentially made the case that economics is narrative-based, that actually more than anything, it's the stories that we tell ourselves that drive major economic shifts. I know there's also plenty of research to show that actually, given the choice between a good life in objective terms, or a good story to tell ourselves about our lives, most people would actually feel more comfortable with the good story than the good reality. So it's almost impossible to imagine a more important field. I wonder, would you either, like, is there any sort of current research that you're involved in that you'd like to tell us about? Or are there sort of major gaps in this whole area of thought that you feel are priority for future research and action to fulfill?
Well, I guess I'd answer that first by the current research. I have gotten involved in some projects to try to apply this to help people, and being an educator myself, a lot of this is done in educational settings. One of my graduate students and I did a study with people entering high school in the United States, which is, I think, one of those really important transition times. And in this particular school, people switch schools from 8th grade, they go to a new school at 9th grade, and it's a big adaptation for a lot of kids. And we did one of these fairly benign looking story editing interventions where at the beginning of the year, we pointed out to them that many people struggle at first, but they tend to get better. And we expected this would be particularly important for people who are traditionally not accepted in society to hear, namely minority students, and this was a primarily white high school. They may be particularly prone to think this is not a place that's welcoming to me. And so this intervention we did at their orientation at the beginning of the school year, and then we tracked them for the year. And as we hoped, particularly the minority students did better academically if they got this message than if they didn't. In terms of the biggest challenges, there are by now a lot of these demonstrations of successful interventions, but how to scale them up, I think, is a tough question. And I think it's important to start small when we don't know how well these will work, and to marshal our resources into, in our case, one high school with a limited number of students. But the next step is to figure out how to, at a larger policy level, to convince policymakers that this is something that should be scaled up. But there are challenges there, not just financial, of will this same intervention that worked in this one school work in every school? Probably not. It depends on the particular ecology of that school and what message will be most effective. So there are people working on this, but it's very challenging to go from the small study to the big policy changes.
Tim, thank you so much. We have learned so much from you, and there's so much more we could continue to talk about. As Paul says, it's such an important and fascinating conversation. Got so many personal takeaways myself here, but we do need to draw our gathering to a close as we've reached our time. We always end our gatherings on time. Thank you for everyone joining us this evening. I'm sure many of you will want not just to be spectators, but to work with us and to support your peers and build your achievements by joining MarketingKind. Information on how to do this is available on our website. As a reminder, on a few upcoming gatherings, we've got Coffee with a Cause with Breaking Barriers on November the 26th. We've got our next digital fireside on December the 1st with author of Good Advertising, Thomas Colster, and how we can inspire collective action on the climate emergency. And our Your MarketingKind gathering on brand generosity with Benazir Barlett Batada on 14th December. And some very exciting opportunities in the new year, including our first in-person and online hybrid gathering in January, and also an xChange in which we'll ask, can we rescue humanity, with Ian Goldin, former Vice President of the World Bank, former advisor to President Nelson Mandela, and founder of the Oxford Martin School, established to find solutions to the world's most pressing problems. Some amazing activities for us all to get involved in. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Good night.